Good afternoon. Welcome to our program on one of my favorite topics, pie. Our speaker today is Alice Wolfgang. She is a veteran pie demonstrator at the Goshenhoppen Folk Festival and is well known among friends and family for making wonderful pies. And she has been working on transcribing the Nancy Rowan files. Nancy, who passed away last year, was a Goshenhoppen historian who was multi-talented, both in food and in textiles, and she did a great deal of research into local food history. And today we have available some recipe cards from our presentation. It's 10 of the very best pie recipes, and you can purchase these down at our museum front desk for $5 for a set. So if you want to know lemon sponge or swiveler cooker, just, buy these cards. Our next program, brown bag program, is going to be Wednesday, August 14th, and it's going to be on Ralph Berkey, Butter Valley naturalist and birder. And he was a unique individual that roamed the Butter Valley. And I remember as a child being in church at Hereford Mennonite, now Butter Valley Community, and Ralph would be in his overcoat and wool cap even when it was hot. And when he left church, there would be bird seed on the pew. You can tell where Ralph sat. So please come to hear that program. And at the end of the program today, we have a bit of a surprise for you. We'll have small samples of some pies that you can come to the back table and get a piece. I didn't want to announce that ahead of time because I was afraid we'd have a pie stampede. But some of our volunteers were kind enough to make a pie. So with that, Alice.
So thank you, Sarah. What you didn't mention is that we're sisters, but maybe you figured out just by us standing next to each other. So welcome. I'm delighted to see that so many of you are pie enthusiasts, especially without knowing that you're going to be fed pie. So I'm very happy to have you here. I don't recall where the title of this presentation came from, Pie, Glorious Pie, but I think it indicates, my interest in pie. I like making pie. I certainly like eating pie. And I like talking about pie, which is why, I can talk about pie for an hour. And how is the sound? Sarah, can you hear back there? Are we good? All right. Yes. So we're going to start out here with the origins of pie, and it comes from pie originated in Europe, and the English are credited with bringing pie to the New World, to America. So we Pennsylvania Germans like to think it's always been our idea. I'm afraid that is not the case. The English get credit for that. And this is a fish pie. Now, pie was not a German tradition, as I just said, and the English get total credit. But when our ancestors learned how to make pie from our English neighbors, they really ran with it. I mean, I think we can take credit for having brought it along. So there's not even a dialect word for pie. So boy or pie is just a Dutchified English word. According to our local food historian, Nancy Rowan, and Sarah had mentioned her, I have a picture of her here shortly, and I'll be quoting from her research and her archives. According to her, the earliest pies were baked in a shallow redware dish and were simply a layer of a bread or yeast dough, topped with a single layer of fruit. No deep dish, nor as sweet as what we have today. Pie was served at every meal, even breakfast. We can all live with that. And the filling depended upon the season and the preservation available. So again, it was just yeast dough, like I almost picture like the equivalent of a pizza, just a yeast dough with a single layer of fruit. So not nearly as sweet as what we expect today. So here's the 1736 Henry Auntie's house, and this is where the Goshenhoppen Folk Festival is held each year. If you've never been there, I certainly can recommend it. Note that the bake oven to the left here, and it's separate from the house. It is not the original bake oven, but it was built on the foundation, as far as I understand. So some pie was eaten 3 times a day, and families, of course, could be quite large. A lot of pies were required. So Nancy Rowan told me this story of a Mrs. Sadie Byler of Berks County. Her mother, so Sadie's mother, baked pies in an outdoor bake oven, reasoning that this must have been in the late 1800s. This is a quote from Nancy. I asked her if they didn't have a cook stove and why her mother didn't use it for baking. And she replied, "Oh my goodness, you couldn't get them all in the stove." So the bake oven could hold anywhere from 20 to 24 pies in one baking, one firing. So that was considered practical. Pies would be baked in a bake oven about once or twice a week, usually on a Friday, if just once, and then carried either to a spring house or to the cellar to be kept cooler. I don't know how far back this particular memory goes, but Nancy told me that her mother, that would have been Cora Hassan, who was born in 1903, she had an old friend from Earl Township, Berks County, who recalled her mother. I mean, this is getting convoluted, I know, but just to explain, her mom baked 25 pies 2 times a week. No, right, that's 50 pies. Now, they would have been smaller than what we're all picturing, the 9-inch pies. They would have been more like 6 inches or 7 inches, but still 50 pies. God love it. So here we have a picture of Nancy there on the right. And here's from her interview with Cora Hassan, her mom. And this interview was done in 1984. And this is what her mom said. Baking day started the evening before, cutting up pumpkin, peeling apples, maybe stewing raisins or grating lemons for next day's baking. Summertime, we were sent barefoot to look for berries, cherries, or apples along the fence roads. Harvest time was different too. Day laborers came before breakfast and did not go home till after supper, even if a shower came up. So that tells us not only were they then baking for the family, they also had the laborers that came in there and, you know, also were eating. So you have Nancy here on the right, and on the left is our women at the festival demonstration preparing foods. All right, now this quote is from Ruba Luft, and she was born in Clayton, Berks County. And her mother was Sally Schultz, a good Schweinfelder name. And this quote's disjointed, but it has good information in, so I wanted to include it. And this is what Ruba said. Friday was bake day, made about 20 to 30 pieces. Made yeast Thursday afternoon. That would have been cooking potatoes, mash, add sugar, a little salt. Bought a lump of yeast, 2 quarts. Put 1 quart away for next week, kept in cellar. Firing oven. Okay, so here we're talking about the bake oven. Men brought in wood 24 inches long. So I'm picturing about like that. Put paper in the oven first. Bake oven was like a shanty hooked onto the house. So that's different than what you see here with the auntie's house. Some bake ovens were attached to the house. Had an iron door, pushed the wood in, closed the door about 1 hour to burn. Any kind of wood. 10 loaves of bread, 5 raised cakes, 4 or 5 shoe fly and pies, depending on the season. Some had lids, but not the apple tarts. Closed the door 1.5 hours. Also had a cook stove. There were 10 children, 2 hired hands, and mom and pop. So that there we have a family of 14. Okay, there's a bit more clarity from this diary entry from Henry K. Landis in 1935. And I quote, "After firing the oven for 2 hours or more, Mama could tell if the temperature was just right by the glow of the bricks. She'd quickly rake out the embers, wipe the oven floor with her swab, and tested the oven by," have you heard of this? Sticking her arm in, and counting to 10. If she could do so without removing her arm, it was perfect for the bread. Right. Others tested the heat of the oven by throwing flour on the oven floor. If it was light brown, it was ready. If it was black or burning flour, it meant it was too hot. And then you had to wait a bit. So Mama needed to work quickly to place the bread in the oven before it cooled. After the bread was baked, many fruit and custard pies went in. Last of all, a sponge cake or two was baked for Pop or Grandpa. So you just, when you think about that, the level of skill that would take and the amount of experience, just going with, how long did the fire burn? And they don't address what happens if it was too cool. I guess you just start over again. But meanwhile, you'd have your bread presumably ready to go in, and you'd have your pie fillings. And if it was hot weather, like what we're experiencing, the thought of having to start that fire over again is not a happy thought. Pies were carried to the bake oven and then after baking to the cellar on a pie board. And a pie board would hold about 6 small pies. And the Goshenhoppen Historians Museum, they have one of these pie boards. It has a raised edge so that the pies wouldn't slide off as you were going down the stairs. So if you picture like a large board where you would roll out your dough and then just picture a wooden edge around it, that would be what a pie board would look like. To be kept out of the reach of rodents, they'd be placed in a hanging shelf suspended from the ceiling or a pie safe with punch tin doors or sides for ventilation. By the 19th century, pies were a puff pastry type of dough, so what we're more familiar with today. So yeast dough became a thing of the past for most cases, and now they're using more of a puff pastry, and had developed a second crust. All pies had a top crust with the exception of custards. So bakers developed different markings to indicate the filling. One would not want to set out 6 raspberry pies, for example, on the table. I mean, how shameful that would be. And then there's the open face apple pie, best described by Frederick Lees in his 1950 book, The Pennsylvania Dutch, where he writes, I love this quote. Maybe you've heard it before. I dare to proclaim the Berks County apple tart the best pie between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And while I'm at it, I'll include South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia as well. Like he covered that. I love that quote. And here's the recipe. Sarah had mentioned the recipe cards that you're welcome to purchase. You're also welcome to take pictures as we go through here. Obviously, not all of these recipes are going to be in there and vice versa. We just picked 10 recipes to print out. So here's the elbakuka or apple cake that Frederick was talking about. And I am going to read it just because, well, I love the ending. Some of you probably are already there. So he provides us with the recipe. And my personal preference for this pie is the yellow transparent apple. That's an heirloom variety, hard to come by. I see a nodding head, that's good to see. It's the best apple in the world, but they're hard to find. And so Lodi is a good substitute, but you might need a little bit more sugar. So here's the recipe. Line a pie dish with rich pastry, cover the bottom generously with 2 tablespoons of flour and a 1/4 cup of sugar. See, there's not much sugar there. Place in the dish halves of apples, peeled and cored, a half facing down in the center and the other half surrounding it. Fill in the crevices between the halves with smaller pieces of apple and sprinkle with 1/4 cup of sugar, a little bit more, and with cinnamon. Are you getting hungry yet? Fill in with rich top milk or light cream till the apples are half submerged and dot each half with butter. Bake in a hot oven until the apples are soft, cool, and eat with Thanksgiving like that. There is no top crust. This is what the Pennsylvania Dutch call a tart, whatever that word means elsewhere. This quote is from Lizzie Wolfgang Bauer, and I don't know if she's a relative or not, but I loved seeing that. That was her name. And she also was from Berks County, and this is what she said about baking. And these quotes that I'm getting were all from the work of Nancy Rowan, and she interviewed individuals back in the 70s and early 60s too. She worked at the Frederick home as a cook, and she interviewed residents there. So their memories reached back into the 19th century. So I viewed those interviews as really, really precious commodities. And it was the first thing I transcribed because I thought this is just really good information and precious stuff. And that's where these quotes are coming from. Since I was transcribing her materials anyway, I might as well use them. So this is what Lizzie Bauer says. Baking, bake twice a week, summer or winter, rain or shine, carry pies to bake oven on a board, bake 25 pies twice a week. Made a lot of lemon strip. They were small, 6-7 inches. Baked 4 loaves of bread twice a week, Tuesday and Friday. And the bottom chart here demonstrates how Lizzie's mom set pies on the table, so you can see how she would have them available to cut into. They were put on the table along with dinner, not served later as we do today. So pie was just part of the meal. And the eater would cut a piece of pie and put it on his dinner plate after he finished his main meal. So it was just, you didn't have a dessert plate. Here is the traditional Pennsylvania Dutch pie crust. I literally got this recipe when I was a child and was at the Goshenhoppen Folk Festival. I was a shy kid. So the fact that I asked the pie ladies for the recipe indicates I must have had a sample and I must have really wanted it. And my mom was there. I don't, she made pie. I don't know why I just didn't ask mom. But they told me this recipe, and then I ended up being a demonstrator at the festival in the pie demonstration for many years using that recipe. So I do like that connection. And I also like this quote. I'd heard it many times. I was a middle school art teacher, and I would tell my students this when they were rolling out clay. But I didn't know who said it until I was, again, working with Nancy Rowan's notes. So it's a Viola Miller who was credited with saying this in 1957. Are you ready for this one? If a girl cannot roll pie dough round, she is not ready to run with the boys. So a little pressure there on the women. And here's the recipe that we use for sweet dough. Very similar to AB cake, if you're familiar with AB cake. So not always just plain pastry. So oftentimes pies, the crust, and you had a top crust, except for the custards and that one apple tart. But sweet dough strips were, and sometimes still are used. So sweet dough is similar to AB cake dough, and it adds a bit more sweetness to the pie if that's needed. So like an elderberry pie or a lemon strip or a schnitz or dried apple pie will benefit from sweet dough. And here's a pan of elderberries from the auntie's house last year at the festival. And they were picked by, if you've been to the festival, if you're familiar with the beekeeper, his daughter would be the young woman here, and then grandchildren picked the berries for us and brought them over to us. So like we thought, this is a real authentic moment here. The elderberry plant actually was donated by our older brother, and it certainly has grown, and elderberries were just ripe at the right time. So these children brought us these elderberries to use. Man, I had talked to them about it. I actually asked mom and said, do you need something for the kids to do? And of course she did. And so they checked back with us pretty frequently until we finally just said another half hour. And then at the end of the festival, they did get an elderberry pie, right? We couldn't not give a pie to those faces. But it probably was 8 hours later. And part of their day was going back and forth between grandpa at the beekeepers and checking on us to make sure that pie, done, not done, don't give it away. So here's an elderberry pie with this sweet dough strips. I have the Dutch there, Mikkekep. Anybody happen to know what that translates into? Shout it out if you know. Fly's head. Yes, fly's head. I don't know very much dialect, but that is one thing that I know. So you can see, if you know elderberries, where the name comes from. And of course, you need a recipe then for elderberry pie. This is from the Mennonite Community Cookbook from 1950. It's a pretty simple pie, pretty straightforward. How many of you have had elderberries? Oh, wow, excellent. This is a knowledgeable crew here. Oh, then you know what you're getting into. It's a very tart little berry. I don't know people that eat them raw, but you could, just better than pie. So crumb toppings. Now they're more popular today, certainly easier than rolling out strips or making a lattice crust. But they weren't found in this region until the 20th century. So I'll say that's a modern invention, the crumb. And the pie that I made to share is a crumb pie. Like I thought about sweet dough strips, too much work on a hot day. So I just did the easy thing too and made a crumb pie. But if you attend the festivals and come to the pie demo, you would see custards and you might see a top crust, or you might see sweet dough strips. We would not do a crumb pie because that just was not done in the 19th century. So on the right, I heard that, Tom. On the right, here we see a funeral or raisin pie, given that name as it was so often served at a funeral meal. Sweet dough is hardly necessary, as raisin pie is quite sweet enough on its own, but it's still delicious. Funeral pies were originally made with dried cherries, as all households would have a supply of dried cherries. But once raisins were readily available at the country store, they were used as well. And estate inventories helped support the idea of the dried cherries, although Nancy told me that many times and I never questioned her. She was a pie queen. Like if she said it, it had to be. But here's from the inventory of a Michael Albrecht from Douglas Township in Montgomery County, 1808. And I quote, 8 bags with dried apples and cherries. No idea how big the bags were, but the fact that that was part of the inventory of his estate, dried apples and dried cherries. Before 1850, so think pre-Civil War, fruit was either fresh or dried. One could have fresh pumpkins and apples up until around Christmas, when you'd switch over to dried fruit. And drying was economical. You could be placed in the bake oven at the end of the baking day and in the 18th century and left to dry overnight. So after you do all that baking, you still weren't done, you could put in trays of fruit and leave it there overnight. And that residual heat then would dry your apples. And this is a prune pie that we made last year at the festival. It's okay. I don't have a recipe for it, so I don't think you want it. The wood cook stove was a 19th century invention, and one could dry vegetables on top of the stove in a large dryer, and fruit could be dried on a tray beneath the stove. The mason jar and canning, that didn't become available until the latter part of the 19th century. And then after World War I, when mechanically blown jars could be made, then they became affordable. And then that became also something that was part of the household tasks. Interesting side note here. In the 1870s, a jar cost 13 cents. And this was a significant cost that would translate into $3 today. So if you're a canner and you buy canning jars, yes, they're expensive, but I don't think we're quite here. I also thought I would take the opportunity to talk about how a wood stove works. Over the years at the festival, more and more people have asked us about like how does this work? And oftentimes we get the question, well, how long does it take to bake a pie in there? And the answer to that, it takes as long as any other way of baking, because it's a matter of the heat. But just so that if you're not aware, did any of you grow up with a wood cook stove? I don't want to tell you. Oh, wonderful. Do any of you still use a wood cook stove? Fewer hands, but one. And so we often get these questions at the festival, and we are demonstrating and we're talking. So it is easy to burn a pie. We never admit to that though. We always refer to it as unevenly browned. So and our stoves are old. You can see that right here. So here is where the firebox is up here. Over here is where you would have draft. Now, that currently is open because you want oxygen. Let me come back to the previous slide. You want oxygen to draw up, to keep the fire burning. So here, these are lids that you can take off with a lid lifter and put the firewood in there. And it can be, if it's smaller pieces of firewood, it will burn more quickly. So if you want a hot fire, if you want to cook something on the stove top, like here we are heating up water for our dishwater, or back here is a pot with some dried apples in to reconstitute. If you want it hot, you just burn smaller pieces of firewood, and you would have this open on the side. This could also be open for draft. And then up on the stovepipe itself is a butterfly, which you could open and close again to adjust the amount of oxygen that it's getting. So nonetheless, this part of the stove up here is always the hottest. And so if you were baking in the 19th century, you're constantly moving these pies because you could have a pie sitting here that would be half burnt and half completely raw. So you're turning them and adjusting them as you go. Challenging. And this spot right here is where you would clean out the soot. And this object down, I didn't take these pictures with the idea of explaining the stove, or I'd have better pictures. I need to do that. This here would be for shaking down the ashes. So you could open this up and there's an ash can in here. And once you get a lot of ash build up because of the firewood burning, then you would shake that down again to allow more of a draft and to keep the fire going. Hope that was clear. It's a little more tricky, let's say, than, electricity. We have had people ask us where our stoves are plugged in, which is, I think, a very cute question. So I told you that about the unevenly browning because I knew I was going to show you this picture. So here's a schnitz pie that's unevenly browned. Schnitz were peeled dried apples that were less sweet. They're even called sour apples, and they were used for schnitz pie. The sweeter varieties of apples had the peel left on, and they were dried to use in schnitz and neck, if you're familiar with that dish. The word schnitz simply means a small piece. So using dried apples for pie began at Christmas time, probably the time that the fresh apples were used up. I think this is a wonderful pie, so I do have the recipe for you. So this is the pie that we make at the festival, demonstrating with the dried apples. And just in case you would also like to try schnitz and neck, not a pie, but I put it in there. Anyway, did I go too fast up here? I can go back if you need the picture. Do you need a picture? Okay. Okay. There's schnitz pie. It's a very good pie. We good. I don't want to go too fast here. And then the schnitz and neck. You want to make that too. Never had a meal of schnitz and neck with schnitz pie. It might be a good thing. Lemon was a popular flavor, but possibly more appropriate after 1850. Many lemon pie recipes abound from the 19th century. We've tried quite a few at the festival. Sarah makes a great lemon strip, and that's a cooked lemon filling with sweet toast strips on it. And my daughter always makes a lemon sponge or a lemon crumb. In fact, in Nancy's recipes, I know I don't know, I suspect that there are some duplicates, but I did count up 34 lemon pie recipes. And I'm guessing there's a lot of similarity, or maybe one has, a fourth cup of sugar more than another one. But just the fact that she bothered to record that many, well, she liked lemon too. So here's a lemon sponge from the festival last year that I just thought was beautiful. They're getting hungry, Sarah. I'll just torture them for another half hour yet. All right. And here's a lemon crumb also from the festival. Once we even tried a lemon meringue, but okay, so picture August outside. We had an apprentice that year, so that poor girl, and she never came back. But we had like a small wooden tool with almost like a tulip type of thing on the bottom, and you just did this in the egg whites. And I wrote in my notes that she did it for an hour. That's probably an exaggeration, but she really worked at it, and she did get the egg whites beaten up. And I wish I would have taken a picture of that pie, because never again would we ever do that. But lemon crumb, lemon sponge, those are all good. And custards. Custards came in many varieties and flavors, because just a few peaches could be stretched by making them into a custard pie. Very practical. And here's, just the beginnings of that. So you just peel a few peaches, you mix up a bath of custard, and you can make, again, if you're making 50 pies, I think custard is the way to go. And I mentioned Lizzie Bauer before, and this is a recipe from Nancy Rowan's archives, and this is for her peach custard. Very straightforward: eggs, flour, milk, sugar. And you could mix that up and put it over any fruit. or a few berries, raspberries, blackberries, mulberries, gooseberries, currants. These are all custards from last year's festival. And the same brother that donated that elderberry plant, he grows gladiolas. And when I put those pies there, I'm like, picture time. I just thought that was beautiful. And blueberries. Wine berries. Does anybody have access to wine berries? Wonderful for custards. Okay, we're going to get into some weird ones. Green tomato pie. One is reminded of our ancestors' thriftiness. Pie could be made from almost anything edible. At the end of the growing season, when frost was imminent, green tomatoes still in the vine could be picked and stored for some time yet. As the weather grew colder, and a green tomato pie. Who here has had green tomato pie? Okay, not too many, and there's a reason for that. It does taste vaguely like an apple pie, yes, because it has, you know, similar seasonings and similar to an apple pie, cinnamon and cloves, lots of brown sugar. Here's the recipe if you want it. This is what we use at the festival. Don't make a whole lot of them. Usually one goes pretty far. Sour milk, which probably was readily available before refrigeration, could be used to make cottage cheese. And Sarah would bring us like a 5-gallon bucket of milk that she left raw milk set out overnight, and it was beautifully, you know, sour in August. And if you heat that till it feels hot to your finger, again, we weren't, you know, we would just stick our finger in it and go like, oh, that's probably right. And then you add some vinegar, it curdles, and you strain it. And then you have these wonderful curds to use in a cottage cheese custard. And back in the day, the way that was left over would be fed to the pigs. And one year at the festival, in the interest of authenticity, we did exactly that. We thought we were wonderful. We had the raw milk, we made the cottage cheese curds, we were baking the pie, we sent the way over to the piggies. And I don't know who took it over, but later on we heard from the people working with the animals, don't do that again. Apparently whey was a little hard on the piggy digestive system. So we were all excited about being authentic, and then no, don't do that. So, but the curds make a lovely and tangy custard, especially if you serve with some molasses. Anybody ever have a cottage cheese custard with molasses? Okay, that is lovely. And here's a simple recipe for a cottage cheese pie. In the recipe cards is the one from Joan Kaiser Landis, of the Alan Kaiser's sister. It's a more complex recipe because she made her own cottage cheese. So that recipe is in the recipe cards that Sarah mentioned, but this is a more simple one to start with. A lesser known fruit is the ground cherry. Ground cherries are an annual garden plant that bear small yellow fruit that falls to the ground when they're ripe, which we assume is the reason for the name. And these would be growing in the garden over at the auntie's house at the festival, so you can see the plant, and as well as. We do not know for sure the source of the dialect phrase Utakasha for this fruit, although Nancy Rowan speculated, when I always went to her with all questions, that the Jewish faith was considered not the true faith, so sort of a false faith, much like this fruit is not really a cherry. That was her speculation. And here we have a ground cherry pie that's ready to go in the oven. And I'm just telling you that story just because it just happened again at the festival last year. Our family grew up calling ground cherries chew cherries, and chew, C-H-E-W, never gave it a thought until one year at the festival. I can still picture exactly where I was, and I can picture the man's back because he said, "You're being politically incorrect," and he walked off. Like, and I can picture his back because I stood there going, "What? Just talking about pie." And then I stood there and it had dawned on me. My parents were really Dutchy. My father had a horse named Cherry. And I thought that he gave his horse a really sissy name, but I never asked him about that. And it wasn't until I went, oh, we've been calling them a Jew cherry without realizing that. And someone at the festival last year said to us, "Oh, we call them chew cherries." And I thought, well, now I need to explain this, where that came from. It's just being very, very Dutchy. So. let's go with brown cherry. Here's a white potato custard. This is a dessert pie. We made it once at the festival, never again. Well, here's what you do. I don't have the recipe for you, but if you really want it, I can talk to you later. You take a medium-sized potato, mash it, add a spoonful of butter. Okay, now we're talking. A half cup of sugar, beat until creamy, and then add 2 egg yolks, a half cup of milk, and the grated rind and juice of a lemon. Just make a lemon pie. Don't go through all this. Right. And then you added stiffly beaten egg whites. So just make a lemon pie. The pumpkin pie that we know of today is more aptly called a pumpkin custard. And this is something that Nancy corrected me on multiple times, so I finally learned my lesson. So if I was talking about making pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving or Christmas, she would immediately correct me. You're not making pumpkin pie, you're making pumpkin custard. Ah, okay. So this pie that you see here is a true pumpkin pie. We got the recipe from the archives and we made this last year. It's made with sliced and peeled raw pumpkin, or you could use butternut squash. We made 2 at the festival. We weren't sure how big to cut the pumpkin. It's raw pumpkin, so you want it small enough that it would bake. And here we have in Nancy's handwriting, her mother's recipe. And she says there to about the size of corn kernels. So we made one with really small pieces and one a little bigger, baked them both. We took the pie over to Alan Kaiser, who has volunteered at all 55 festivals. I consider him like the expert. He and Nancy were just the two. And he has an incredible memory, razor sharp memory. He not only had pumpkin pie, he had Cora Hassan's, Nancy's mother's pumpkin pie. So I went over to him with this offering, here, what do you think? And he said it was right. And oh, that just, that made my day. It was right. Kaiser said so. Here's another unusual pie called peppermint pie. It's from York County. And this uses peppermint or spearmint, like what you would grow for tea. Here's the recipe if you want to try it. It's an easy pie. We're not quite sure how much to put in. What we did, we liked, we tasted it. The main ingredient is peppermint. I don't want to go too fast. Just wave your hand if you're taking a picture, and so I don't change the screen before you get it. Can I just say, Beth, too, that the archives will be made available, I'll say soon. And the cumulative file of her recipes is over 200 pages. And that will soon be, at some point, be available on the Schwenkfelder website. Beth has been working at this, and she has this whole process started, and it is quite a process. But so all of these recipes that I'm showing you, you would have access to at some point in the future, but you can start a baking one. So mincemeat pie is a good example of the English tradition of pie making. We will grant the English the mincemeat pie. But this is something I read on PBS just last December, and I'm like, what? But okay, I'm quoting PBS. The mince pie has, and they said, thankfully, can you believe it? Evolved from a savory 13th century dish filled with suet, actual minced meat, and chopped fruit, into a sweet butter pastry treat made primarily with raisins, liquor, and wintery spices like cinnamon and cloves. I beg to differ. We all put meat in our mincemeat, right? No. Oliver Cromwell, mentioning him, viewed eating the pies as an example of extreme gluttony and made them illegal during his 17th century reign. And the modern pies are often eaten cold and normally only in December. So the English are still making mincemeat pie, a little different than what we're familiar with. And this particular pie was being assembled by demonstrators at Pennypacker Mills, another excellent place to visit. And here's what it looks like baked. So in a 1971 interview with Hannah Clemens of Lansdale, Abe Rowan, Abe was Nancy's husband, had a chance to ask about the traditions in her family. One comment she made was that green tomato pie, quote, tastes about as good as ground cherry pie. I don't know if that means it's really, really wonderful or like, I don't know. Then she started talking about mince pie. She said her mother would use 3 times as many apples as meat. And here's the quote, "Too much meat spoils them." When asked about using beef or pork, she said her mother just used beef, but Grandma Clemens used pork sometimes. And her mother made wine from rose petals for her mincemeat. And here's what she related, and I quote, "They were big bushes and they were very full of flowers. And then she'd go out and gather in the morning. She'd take a crock and she'd just brush the petals in a crock and then put water on them and leave them stand, I don't know how long. And then she'd put sugar in it. It was very sweet. And she used that in her mince pie. Rose petal." There are variations on mincemeat as well. This is Nancy's, and I didn't like mincemeat pie until I've had hers. Hate to say it, but I didn't like my own mother's mincemeat. But I have not, how many of you make mincemeat? Ooh, that's one hand. Bless you, that's wonderful. I keep trying to tell myself to do this. In fact, there was a recent posting on the Schwenkfelder Facebook site for the watermelon preserves because Nancy preserved her own watermelon rind for her mincemeat. So if you look on the Schwenkfelder site, you can see that, how she did that. All right, so here's Nancy's recipe, which is like the best in the world. I just said that. Here's mince pie without meat or apples. We did try it. If you scan through that recipe, I don't see anybody taking a picture. What a surprise. The main ingredient is bread. And I was not prepared to like it because I thought it's got to be soggy. I don't like soggy bread. But it wasn't too bad. It wasn't too bad. I was pleasantly surprised. And I thought, if you didn't have, I thought, well, this is kind of like a poor man's mincemeat. If you didn't have the meat, this wasn't bad. Cup of molasses, cup of sugar, cup of vinegar, cup of butter. But, you add in some cloves and some cinnamon, enough of that. It's good.
Like sweet stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, see, I don't like bread on my spoon. No, I was not prepared to like this. All right, here's another one. All right, this is one that uses hard-boiled eggs. Nancy says here, I put her note in, 1867 recipe book printed by a medicinal company. Like, what are you doing printing mince pie recipes? Anyway, came close to trying this last year at the festival, but the other pie ladies weren't too enthused. And so we never did. So if you want to try this, it will be interesting. This one we did try, the green tomato mincemeat, and this is from Mary at the Farm. So this is not a Nancy Rowan one. I just wanted to include it. So you can see the ingredients here and the comment there at the end. This mincemeat is both good and cheap and is a splendid substitute for old-fashioned mincemeat. And I remember it being, pretty good. But the fact that you have to cook the tomatoes 3 3/4 hours, that just seems, I don't know why. But another use for green tomatoes. Shoe fly. Okay, we're out of the odd ones now. Probably the best known. Pennsylvania Dutch pie is a shoe fly. Can be made in pie form, in cake form, and in bread form. It sometimes is called a molasses crumb cake, even when it's a pie. Regardless, a wet bottom of gooey molasses is generally preferred. Lots of nodding heads, yes. Do you know the song? It's from 1945. Dinah Shore sang this song, and this is what we credit the idea of shoe fly, getting across the nation. I was kind of hoping Candace would stop by. I'd ask her to sing that for us because she has a wonderful voice. But anybody want to give it a go for the rest of us? Okay, look it up on YouTube. Yeah. So here's the shoe fly recipe from my mom's tablet. I like that she has the classic lard like an egg. Like, thank you, Mom. And then the spelling of shoe fly. Her spelling was excellent. So I'm not quite sure, maybe she copied it from somewhere. And we have seen that spelling. It's more commonly spelled with 2 O's, but she has the OE here. And here's the recipe that I use. Not surprisingly, came from Nancy Rowan. It's a pretty basic one. Shoe fly is not the only pie that is really a cake. There is funny cake, yes, a chocolate layer in the bottom of the crust and topped with a yellow cake batter. And then there's Montgomery pie, which is the same thing, only with lemon. Among other cakes baked in pastry are a McKinley pie, Quakertown crumb pie, and crumb cakes, all of which are pies. And I offer you here the recipe for funny cake, and I tried to squish in both the chocolate and the lemon filling, so I have a feeling people are gonna be baking pies when they get home. Alrighty. Here's McKinley cake. Very similar to shoe fly. I'm reading through it going, what's the difference? Cinnamon. I don't know of any shoe fly recipe that calls for cinnamon. So this is McKinley cake. Haven't tried it. And here's a wonderful photograph from the H. Winslow Fegley collection that's here at the Schweinfelder circa early 1900s, entitled Preparing Cakes and Pies for Christmas Dinner. I think it's a beautiful photograph. All right, we're about to step away from Pennsylvania Dutch world for a while. Is that okay? Because I want to give you the ricotta cheese pie crust recipe. This is from the Rodale Basic. It's the only time I make a crust that doesn't have lard in it, and I use it for a sour cream peach pie. And so in my world, sour cream peach pie has to go in this crust. And here's what the pie looks like. And I think my daughter and I ate this pie like within 24 hours. Here's the recipe if you want to try it. It is in the Mennonite cookbook if you have that one. You can see my commentary here. You can cut back on the sugar, so you can eat a bigger piece. The sour cream, yogurt can be substituted. It works okay. Sour cream is better. And then of course one pie, but preferably the ricotta cheese crust. And then at the end, like I just can't help giving my opinion, right? Wonderful at room temperature when warm and when chilled. In other words, anytime. I'm pretty sure that pie picture I showed you never even made it into the refrigerator. Like I think I made it at night, we ate a bunch, and then like we're up late talking, and then I'll finish it off. It doesn't get any better. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a pretty basic crust. You gonna try it? It's a wonderful pie. All righty, now that you've looked at about 60 slides of dessert pies, we turn our attention to the main dish. Don't worry, I don't have another 60 slides. So here's a pie baked on hearth coals, and it would have been done in the 18th century. A deep dish oyster pie. Ooh, we have some fans of oyster pie here. And so here's a recipe. I have another one that's easier, but here's this one. I am not a fan of oyster pie, so I have not done this. But Nancy has a note there that this recipe is almost identical to that of Rosanna Hurley from 1850. So an authentic one. And here's the one from the Mennonite Community Cookbook. Again, the Winslow Fegley collection, early 1900s, and this is entitled Preparing Onions for Market. So guess what's coming? Onion pie. A really basic pie. Does anybody make this? It's like, oh wow, okay, we did have a hand there, very good. And this is field corn rather than sweet corn, but I just thought the image was so wonderful. And then here's another Fegley photo of women husking corn. So you know what's coming now. This is a knowledgeable crowd. All right, it's corn pie. This pie remains a favorite today. One fills the pie shell with corn, perhaps diced potatoes, milk, pepper, salt, dab of butter. My father liked hard-boiled eggs chopped up in it. I'm not going to argue with anybody. Whatever you make it is the right way. And here's the recipe that has been used at the Gosh and Hoppen Folk Festival. So this one does have hard-boiled eggs in it. And here's a corn pie in process from the Pennypacker Mills, a demonstration there. And this one had cooked chicken underneath the corn and then some other ingredients, and then they put breadcrumbs on top. So not a classic pie. As part of that demonstration. Begley collection again, potato raising. Another photo, I know, just get to the next one, which is the recipe for grandmother's potato pie. This is from the Mennonite Community Cookbook again. Anybody in here make potato pie? Ooh. We gotta talk. You're raising your hand like all the time. We got a pie expert over there. All right, chicken and pork could also be used in main dish pies. Let me just get to the recipe because we're running a little short on time here. And so here's the chicken pie. We're almost done. I know you're salivating. Another Fegley photo, churning butter. All good Pennsylvania Dutch cooking seems to require butter. That's a serious butter churn. We end with slop or millet pie, the last pie made on baking day. Oftentimes been made by a child. I'm happy to say I got to do this as a child. The remnants of the pie crust were pressed into a dish, spoonful of flour, spoonful of brown sugar, bit of cinnamon were added together right in the crust. You just use this spoon and sort of schmutz it together. Add a pat of butter, fill it up with milk and bake it. Sometimes it's more sloppy than others, but it's always good. Anybody make slop pies? Okay. People often ask for a recipe and there sort of like really isn't, but I went looking just because in case somebody does want one. And these are some suggestions from the Kutztown Folk Festival cookbook. The cookbook was undated. I don't know how, but it was clearly old. So I don't know how old that was. And this, I think, is a cute little note here. No one sets out to make a milk Fletcher. Not technically true. It's just what happens after you finish making other pies and have leftover dough. The ingredients and the size of the shell may vary. Just be sure to have equal amounts of flour and sugar and don't use too much milk. This is always a special treat for children who anxiously waited for it to cool. And I can speak from experience. You don't have to wait for it to cool. You can just burn your mouth. And a friend of mine sent me this pie chart. And that's exactly what I did. Like pie I've eaten, pie I've not yet eaten. And I do need to give credits here for all the people, especially Nancy Rowan and her research that enabled me to put this presentation together. So thank you very much for your attention. And we have a little time for some questions. Beth? Okay. Okay. Do I have a recipe for 18th century yeasted pie dough? I know personally, and I can't think of any in Nancy's archives. I mean, there are recipes for yeast dough, but I don't know that not specifically for pie. But again, that would be available in the archives. But yeah, starting out with potatoes, it sounds pretty tricky. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I wonder when citrus became available for using lemon and orange rind.
Yeah, like we often wondered that too, because there's so many recipes from the 19th century. And we just sort of assume that with being as close to the Port of Philadelphia as we are, and lemons keep long too. And the other little practical thing is a lemon goes a long way. Like you could make lemon pies, and you think of the work that goes into elderberry or sour cherry. Like, so all of those things, they're all pretty much assumptions.
I wonder if the dips are because it's avoiding stir.
Well, that, I think with oranges definitely, but yeah, lemons are, like I said, Nancy has 34 lemon pie recipes. I was looking clearly, yeah, yes.
You had a neighbor that, before that go, she made sugar pies.
Okay,
Pie dough and she put sugar in the bottom with some butter and bacon.
okay, so someone in the heritage of sugar pie, so just sugar and butter in the pie crust and bacon, I'd try that. Are there any other questions or online? Is there any online? Yeah.
Germans from Boston who settled in the Midwest, they kuchen, a clustered cake over fruit. The pie filling stove seems similar based on the crust. Are the fillings traditional German adapted to English pie in this way? Not exactly German. I guess it's asking about your cultural.
Yeah, and I guess it's hard to know specifically, since pie was an English tradition. Someone is asking online about the mix of recipes, yeah, and I just feel, yeah. But I'm willing to try all pie, I have an open mind about pie. Oh, wow, look at that table back there. How are we gonna prevent a stampede? One more question here. Okay, the question up here is, do I always use lard? Absolutely. And do I have trouble finding it? I get it out at Shady Maple. And because it comes in 2-pound tubs, which that's what you want. I have seen it locally, and it has gone from a 16-ounce tub to a 14-ounce tub, which drove Nancy and me nuts for many years until my phone rang and I answered the phone and she just yelled, 2 ounces of butter. And hello, Nancy. And what she was saying is just because we were taking the 14 ounces and then trying to figure out how much flour and that was ridiculous. She said, just add 2 ounces of butter and then you can use the same amount of flour you always did. But yeah, so at Shady Maple, they have it in 2-pound containers for like $6. Yeah, lard. Yeah. Ooh, the question is made of mulberry. You didn't happen to bring one with you, did you? Mulberry sour cherry? Ooh, that's sounding good. Jennifer.
I think land is carried, I believe they will do, if anybody also does a central outside of Cleveland, they carry.
Okay, excellent. Yeah.
I'll also give a plug for, fashion politics, you mentioned the festival so much. We also have a cookbook that has a lot of recipes and it's featured as well, so.
Yeah.
Come to the festival or call the office, to get a copy of that. The current edition is $9. We are working on a new one. I think it will be out by the festival, but I'm not 100% guaranteed.
Nice. Nice. Okay.
May I also make a plug?
Up, here we go. Lots of plugs here.
Alice mentioned that we're looking at growing our pie online, and we are, but in the meantime, we have a sample up under the website /culinary journey. You can go there and get, you want to remember that with the name on that table for that URL, navigate you some.
Thank you. Good plug. All right. It's 1 o'clock. Whoa.
It's online. Taylor Beach recipe is on page 12. The book PA Dutch Cookery.
Okay. All right. There you go. Sounds good. So just to avoid people falling over each other, how about because they sat in the front, let's just go front row first to go back to have, I think they're going to be small samples of pie. So if you want a little bit of pie to taste, why don't we start from the front and work our way back? Which means my friend Tom will never forgive me. What is it? Oh, that's right around it. Okay, that's considered the best. That's from around the kidneys. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have access to that, but if I did.
I have a friend